Did you know? Black Americans are twice as likely to be stopped by police, even when they've done nothing wrong. And in too many cases, those encounters turn into wrongful arrests. But what happens when one of those wrongfully arrested individuals turns out to be a judge, and later finds herself presiding over the very officers who mistreated her? Imagine walking into a courtroom, expecting just another routine misconduct hearing, only to lock eyes with the judge presiding over your case and realize you've seen her before. Not in a courtroom, not in a legal office, but in handcuffs. This is exactly what happened when two officers who thought they could abuse their power without consequences found themselves standing before the very person they had humiliated and arrested without cause. But this time, she had the power. Before we dive into this unbelievable turn of events, take a second to support this channel in the easiest way possible by subscribing. It's completely free, but it helps us bring you more stories that matter. So hit that button and let's get started. The scorching summer sun bore down on Charleston, South Carolina, casting golden hues over Waterfront Park. The air carried the scent of salt from the nearby harbor, blending with the laughter of children splashing in the fountain and the distant chatter of tourists strolling along the cobblestone paths. At the edge of the park, a black woman sat alone on a wooden bench, a hardcover book resting on her lap. The occasional breeze rustled the pages, but she hardly noticed. She was too immersed in the legal text before her, absorbing every word. Her name was Monica Evans, a distinguished civil rights attorney known for her sharp legal mind and unwavering pursuit of justice. With her packed schedule, moments like these, sitting peacefully by the water, escaping the pressures of the courtroom, were rare and deeply cherished. That peace, however, was about to be shattered. A sudden screech of tires pulled her from her thoughts. A police cruiser rolled up to the curb, drawing the attention of nearby parkgoers. The two white officers inside exchanged a glance before stepping out, their movements rigid, their expressions unreadable. Monica barely looked up at first, assuming they were responding to an unrelated call. But then she felt it, the weight of their stares settling directly on her. One officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, approached with an air of authority that felt more like intimidation. "Ma'am, we need to have a word with you." His tone wasn't a request, it was a command. Monica met his gaze, her expression calm but guarded. "Of course," she said, carefully closing her book and setting it aside. The second officer, younger, with a buzz cut and a badge that gleamed under the sun, moved closer. His stance was firm, his posture stiff. "We received a report about suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Monica frowned, genuinely puzzled. "Suspicious activity?" She gestured toward the families picnicking nearby. "I'm just sitting here reading, that's all." Neither officer reacted. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded. Monica's heart began to pound, not from fear, but from frustration. This was a scene she had heard about too many times, had fought against in the courtroom, and now she was living it. Still, she remained composed. "May I ask what crime I'm suspected of committing?" The younger officer's jaw tightened. "It's routine," he said flatly. But Monica knew better. She sighed, reaching into her bag and pulling out her wallet. With slow, deliberate movements, she handed over her driver's license. The first officer took it, scanning the details with unnecessary scrutiny. "Monica Evans," he read aloud, almost mockingly. "What's your business here, Miss Evans?" Monica inhaled deeply. "I live here. I came to the park to read. Is that a problem?" The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he returned her ID, but neither of them stepped back. The tension thickened. Instead of leaving, the officers began a different line of questioning, one that had nothing to do with a legitimate concern. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" The younger one sneered. "Are you alone here or waiting for someone?" the other asked, his hand drifting toward his belt in a slow, calculated movement. Monica recognized the tactic. Power play. She had stood in countless courtrooms, dismantling cases with logic and precision. But this was different. Here, in this moment, reason didn't matter, only their authority did. Even so, she held firm. "I won't be answering any more questions," she said, her voice steady, "unless you can tell me exactly what I'm being accused of." That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The older officer's expression hardened. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped, stepping forward. Monica didn't move. "We're just doing our job," he added, his tone dripping with irritation. "And I know the law," Monica countered. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." That was the moment the officer grabbed her arm. "You're resisting," he said coldly. Monica hadn't moved an inch. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Some had already pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. The younger officer reached for his cuffs. And just like that, Monica Evans, the highly respected attorney who had defended countless innocent people from injustices just like this, was being arrested. She took a slow breath, steadying herself as they tightened the cuffs around her wrists. She knew how this worked. She had seen how quickly power could be abused, how easily a badge could be used as a weapon. But what these two officers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the woman they were arresting today would be the judge deciding their fate tomorrow. "What are you doing?" Monica Evans exclaimed, her voice sharp with shock. The murmurs from the growing crowd turned into outraged whispers, a low rumble of disbelief. A man standing nearby pulled out his phone, recording every second. "Stop resisting," the officer barked, louder this time, as if he were performing for the cameras. Monica's heart pounded against her ribs as the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around her wrists. She forced herself to stay calm, but humiliation and anger burned in her chest. She had spent years fighting for justice, protecting the rights of innocent people. Yet here she was, treated like a criminal for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officers ignored the questions from the onlookers as they escorted her toward their cruiser. Just before she was shoved inside, Monica's gaze locked onto a young woman holding up her phone, recording the entire thing. For a split second, there was an unspoken exchange, a silent plea to document everything. The car door slammed shut. Monica closed her eyes. She knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The inside of the police cruiser was stifling. The air was thick with silence, save for the occasional crackle of the radio. Monica sat stone-faced, staring out the window as her reflection blurred against the passing city lights. Her wrists ached from the cuffs biting into her skin, but that was the least of her concerns. She had seen this happen before, too many times, but never like this, never to her. The absurdity of it all nearly made her laugh, but there was no humor in this situation, only rage. At the police station, things went from bad to worse. The booking process was designed to strip people of their dignity. She was fingerprinted, photographed, searched. Every step, every unnecessary delay, felt like a calculated effort to remind her that in this moment she had no power. Finally, an officer led her to a small, dimly lit holding cell. The fluorescent lights above buzzed relentlessly, casting eerie shadows along the concrete walls. As the officer shut the door behind her, he smirked. "Enjoy your stay." The lock clicked into place. Monica sank onto the cold metal bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She replayed the events at the park over and over in her mind. How had a peaceful afternoon turned into this? But she already knew the answer, and it was bitter. Prejudice, power, assumptions. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think strategically. She had been trained for this. This case was weak, the charges wouldn't hold. But that didn't mean the battle ahead would be easy. It never was. Pause. Let's step out of the story for a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right, but people in power refused to listen? It's a special kind of frustration, isn't it? The feeling that no matter what you say, no matter how calmly you argue your case, the decision has already been made. But here's the thing. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone refuses to acknowledge it. And as you're about to see, Monica isn't backing down. Now back to the story. Hours passed, no explanations, no updates. Then at last, a young officer approached her cell, clipboard in hand. "Miss Evans, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer." Monica's eyes narrowed. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The officer barely glanced at her. "You can discuss that in court." And with that, he turned and walked away. Monica clenched her fists, exhaling slowly. She had handled dozens of cases like this, but being on the other side, feeling the weight of injustice firsthand, It fueled her determination. She wouldn't let them get away with this. Eventually, Monica was released on bail. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the stifling oppression inside. Standing near the curb was Marissa Carter, her longtime friend and fellow attorney. The second Marissa spotted Monica, she rushed over, eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice tight. Monica nodded. But the words felt hollow. They got into the car. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, as they reached a red light, Monica broke the silence. "I'm not letting this slide, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What are you thinking?" Monica turned to her, voice firm. "I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening. I have the tools, I have the knowledge, and I have the resources to fight back, and I will." That night, Monica sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads, open law books, and case files. She worked tirelessly, outlining a civil rights lawsuit, not just against the two officers, but against the entire department. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from simmering determination. And she wasn't alone. The video taken by the young woman at the park had gone viral. Within days, Monica was flooded with messages. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own stories of injustice, offering support, demanding action. She read every email, every comment, every phone call, and with each one her resolve only grew stronger. Because now she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed. And she wasn't going to stop. Even as Monica Evans prepared for the legal battle ahead, she couldn't have predicted just how unexpected justice would be. The weeks following her arrest were a blur of emotion and relentless work. Her law firm, typically cautious about public attention, initially hesitated to support her fight. They feared the controversy would overshadow their carefully built reputation. But Monica never wavered. She sat before the senior partners, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about me. If we back down now, what does that say about us? About what we stand for?" There was silence. Then, one of them nodded. "You have our full support." The viral video of her arrest had done more than just tell her story. It had ignited a movement. The footage of Monica, calm yet unyielding as officers dragged her away, had become a symbol of resilience. Reporters called daily, eager for interviews, but Monica turned them all down. She wasn't interested in publicity. Her focus was singular, building a case that wouldn't just hold these officers accountable, but expose the deeper systemic flaws that allowed their behavior to continue unchecked. But when night fell and the world grew quiet, the weight of it all settled in. She replayed the moment over and over, the cold snap of the cuffs, the mocking tone of the officers, the murmurs from the crowd. She knew how easily things could have escalated. That thought alone made her stomach churn. But it also fueled her determination. One evening, as Monica pored over legal documents, her best friend and fellow attorney Marissa Carter arrived with takeout. She placed the food on the table and folded her arms. "You've been at this for hours." Monica didn't look up. "I don't have a choice." Marissa sat across from her, studying her. "You know this is bigger than just a legal case, right?" Monica finally shut her laptop and met her gaze. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "That's why I can't afford to lose." Her preparation was meticulous. She combed through similar cases, pulling legal precedents, gathering evidence, and dismantling the officers' claims piece by piece. She reached out to trusted colleagues, assembling a legal team who shared her passion for justice. But it wasn't just about winning in court. Monica made it a point to engage with the community. She attended town halls, listened to people who had experienced similar injustices, and even gave a talk at a local university on accountability in law enforcement. One afternoon, as she walked toward her car after a meeting, a woman hesitantly approached her. "Miss Evans?" Monica turned. "Yes?" The woman, eyes welling with tears, took a shaky breath. "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to them, for standing up for all of us." Monica felt her throat tighten. She managed a small smile. "I'm just doing what I can." The support from the community empowered her. But it also weighed on her shoulders. She couldn't afford to fail. Then, one morning, Monica received a call that changed everything. It was her attorney. "The officers you're suing just filed a motion to dismiss the case." She expected as much. It was a common stalling tactic. But it was what her attorney said next that made her go still. "Monica, you should know something else. You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." For a moment, Monica said nothing. The irony was staggering. After weeks of preparing to fight these officers in court, fate had handed her a different kind of justice. She leaned back in her chair, processing the weight of it. She had spent her life upholding the law, believing in the system, even when it failed people like her. Could she sit on that bench and remain impartial? Then she thought about everything they had put her through. She thought about the countless people who never got the chance to seek justice. And she realized this wasn't just coincidence. This was an opportunity to show them what real justice looked like. Weeks later, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filed in, finding their seats. The officers, the same ones who had wrongfully arrested her, sat stiffly at the defense table. Their lawyer whispered something to them, but neither responded. Then the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Monica Evans presiding." The officers whipped their heads toward the bench, and for the first time, they recognized her. Monica stepped into the courtroom, her black robe flowing as she approached the bench. She sat down, her expression unreadable, and carefully adjusted the papers in front of her. Finally, she looked up. Her gaze met Officer Ryan Callahan's, the man who had snapped the cuffs on her wrists, who had sneered as he dragged her away. For the first time, his arrogance was gone. Monica let the silence stretch, watching the realization sink in. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she spoke. "Let's begin." The case wasn't particularly high profile, just another internal misconduct hearing involving two officers accused of excessive force in an unrelated incident. To most, it was just another day in the justice system. At the defendant's table, Officers Ryan Callahan and James Miller sat with stiff postures, their uniforms worn like armor. They leaned in toward each other, speaking in low tones, their expressions unreadable. To them, this was just another routine process, a formality, another hurdle they'd clear without consequences. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room fell into a stunned silence. Monica Evans stepped onto the bench, her black robe flowing behind her. She moved with purpose, her face a mask of calm authority as she took her seat. Then, for the first time, she turned her gaze toward the defendants. The reaction was immediate. Officer Callahan stiffened, his face draining of color, his eyes widening in disbelief. Miller shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenching as if struggling to process what he was seeing. It was her, the woman they had humiliated, arrested, and dismissed without a second thought. Monica let the moment linger, allowing the weight of it to settle over the room. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she began. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat rigidly, their usual confidence faltering. Callahan leaned toward their lawyer, whispering something urgently. The lawyer gave the briefest of nods, but his attention remained fixed on Monica. For the first time in weeks, Monica held the upper hand. But she knew this wasn't about revenge. Her job as a judge demanded impartiality, and she would uphold that duty. Yet the irony of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. As the attorneys presented their opening arguments, Monica listened intently, taking careful notes. But every so often, her gaze would flicker toward the officers. She saw it in their shoulders, tight with tension, in their hands, fidgeting slightly. They weren't so sure of themselves anymore. During a brief recess, Callahan and Miller stepped into the hallway, their voices low and urgent. "How is she the judge?" Callahan hissed, his frustration barely contained. Miller shook his head. "This has to be a setup." Their lawyer cut in, his patience thin. "It's not a setup, it's a coincidence, and you need to stay focused." Callahan scoffed, running a hand down his face. "She's not the enemy here," their lawyer added. "Your actions are." But neither officer was really listening. They were too caught up in the surreal nature of their predicament. When court resumed, Monica remained composed, ensuring the hearing proceeded fairly and efficiently. Yet, her mere presence unsettled them. Every time she addressed them, they shifted in their seats, their confidence eroding little by little. At one point during a key witness's testimony, Monica caught Callahan stealing a glance at her. And for the first time, his expression wasn't one of defiance. It was something closer to regret, as if he was finally beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Monica glanced at the clock, then picked up her gavel. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. The sharp crack of her gavel echoed through the silent room. Slowly, the courtroom emptied. Monica lingered at her bench, organizing her notes. She could feel their eyes on her. Callahan and Miller hesitated by the door. They were clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. News of the unexpected twist had spread, drawing a much larger crowd than usual for a misconduct hearing. Some people were there out of curiosity. Others had come to support Monica. Though they knew her role as a judge meant she couldn't take sides, there was a quiet understanding. This case mattered. When Monica entered, she carried herself with the same composed authority as the day before. She knew that today would be pivotal. The officers knew it too. And as the hearing continued, one question lingered in the air. Would justice truly prevail? Monica Evans ascended the bench, her composed demeanor unwavering, the flowing fabric of her black robe trailing behind her as she took her seat. The courtroom hushed in anticipation. This was no ordinary hearing anymore. People wanted to see how justice would be served. The attorneys wasted no time. The prosecutor stood first, his tone measured but firm. He methodically laid out the evidence, displaying photographs, body cam footage, and statements from witnesses. "Your Honor," he began, stepping closer to the jury, "this isn't just a case of poor judgment. This is about two officers who abused their power, leaving an innocent man bruised and broken, both physically and emotionally." The prosecutor turned toward the jury, his voice steady. "The evidence will show that Officers Callahan and Miller didn't act out of fear or necessity. They acted out of prejudice, out of unchecked authority. And that, Your Honor, is a direct violation of the oath they swore to uphold." Monica nodded subtly, her pen gliding across her notepad. She took in every word, every nuance, every shift in tone. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the defendants shift uncomfortably. For the first time, they weren't in control. The defense attorney rose, his voice controlled but strained. "Your Honor," he began, "while we acknowledge that the situation was unfortunate, we firmly believe that the circumstances leading up to it were beyond the officer's control." He paused, glancing briefly at his clients. "Their intent was never malicious, and we argue that there is insufficient evidence to warrant punitive action." Monica remained unreadable, but internally she recognized the pattern. The excuses, the justifications, she had heard them before, she had lived them before. But she forced herself to push her personal emotions aside. Justice, after all, was not about vengeance, it was about truth. When it came time for witness cross-examinations, the air in the courtroom grew heavy. The prosecutor called the victim to the stand, a young man named Ethan Parker. He took a shaky breath, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "Ethan," the prosecutor said, "can you walk us through what happened that night?" Ethan swallowed hard, his voice quiet at first. "I was pulled over for a broken taillight," he said. "I reached for my registration, just like I was told, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground with a knee pressed into my back." The jury stirred at his words. "Did they give you a chance to explain yourself?" Ethan shook his head, his voice cracking. "No, they didn't even let me speak." The prosecutor stepped forward. "Did you resist?" Ethan met Monica's gaze. His voice was firm this time. "No." Silence. "I was scared, but I did everything they told me to. It didn't matter. They had already decided I was guilty." From across the room, Monica caught a flicker of discomfort on Callahan's face. For the first time, she wondered, was it shame or just regret that he had been caught? When the defense attorney cross-examined, he tried to poke holes in Ethan's testimony, suggesting he had made a sudden movement, implying the officers had acted out of instinct. But Ethan held firm, and Monica saw it in the jury's faces. They weren't buying it. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Callahan was first. He walked slowly to the stand, his movements hesitant, uncertain. After swearing the oath, he cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Officer Callahan," the prosecutor began, "you've been accused of excessive force. Can you explain your actions that night?" Callahan hesitated. He glanced at Miller. then back at Monica. "I thought the situation was escalating," he stammered. "I made a judgment call." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "And do you believe that judgment call was justified?" Callahan shifted in his seat. "At the time, yes," he muttered. "But looking back," he exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I could have handled it differently." The prosecutor leaned in slightly. "Handled it differently how? By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual?" Callahan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence spoke louder than any defense ever could. When it was Miller's turn, his testimony was just as strained. He stumbled over his words, attempting to justify his actions, but only dug the hole deeper. As Monica listened, she felt a mixture of frustration and pity. These men had been given authority, and yet they had wielded it recklessly, leaving a trail of harm behind them. By the time the closing arguments began, the case had already been decided in the court of public opinion. The prosecutor delivered a powerful statement, urging the jury to set a precedent that abuse of power would not be tolerated. When the defense made its closing argument, it lacked conviction. Even the officers themselves seemed resigned to the likely outcome. The truth had been laid bare. Monica took a slow breath, then lifted her gavel. "This hearing is adjourned. We will reconvene tomorrow for final deliberations." The gavel struck the bench with authority, echoing through the silent room. As the courtroom emptied, Monica remained seated, organizing her notes. From the corner of her eye, she saw Callahan and Miller standing near the door. They hesitated. For a moment, it looked like they might approach her. But in the end, they didn't. They left quietly, the weight of the moment hanging heavy over them. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. Monica Evans sat tall behind the bench, her voice steady and unwavering as she made her final announcement. "A ruling will be delivered 1 week from today." The courtroom slowly emptied, but officers Callahan and Miller remained near the exit, their once arrogant demeanor completely gone. For the first time, they looked afraid. The reality of what awaited them had finally set in. This case was no longer just about them. It had become a symbol of something far greater. But Monica knew justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about accountability, about change, about ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. A week later, the courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every breath held. Reporters lined the back wall, pens poised, cameras ready. This was no longer just a disciplinary hearing. It was a moment in history. Monica entered, her black robe flowing as she ascended the bench. The tension was thick, nearly suffocating. Callahan and Miller sat at the defense table, their heads bowed, shoulders tense. They already knew. But the courtroom needed to hear it. Monica took a slow breath before speaking. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, it erodes public trust and causes harm that extends far beyond the immediate victim. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. This case has laid bare the consequences of such actions. She turned her attention to the two officers. The evidence presented has demonstrated that officers Callahan and Miller acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold. Their actions were not only unjustified, but indicative of a troubling pattern that must be addressed. Callahan exhaled sharply, as if bracing for the verdict. "The court rules as follows," Monica continued. "Both officers will be placed on mandatory suspension without pay. They will be required to complete extensive retraining programs focusing on de-escalation and ethical policing. A formal disciplinary record will be attached to their files, ensuring full transparency moving forward." It was a firm but fair ruling, one that struck a balance between accountability and the opportunity for reform. When she finished, Monica picked up her gavel and brought it down with a decisive strike. "This court is adjourned." A hushed murmur spread across the courtroom. The officers stood, their expressions somber as they prepared to leave. But before exiting, Callahan hesitated. Slowly, he turned back toward the bench. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Your Honor?" He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Monica held his gaze. She didn't respond immediately. She could tell he meant it. But apologies were not enough. Change was not about words. It was about actions. So she simply nodded. And just like that, he was gone. As the courtroom emptied, Monica remained seated, taking a moment to reflect. Justice had been served, but the victory felt bittersweet. For every high-profile case like this, there were countless others that went unspoken, unresolved. She knew that reality all too well. Later that evening, Monica attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was filled with people, citizens eager to share their frustrations, their fears, their hopes. She sat and listened. Because justice wasn't just about rulings in courtrooms, it was about real conversations, real change. As the meeting came to a close, an elderly woman approached her, gripping her hand tightly. Her voice trembled with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "What you did in that courtroom, it means the world to us." Monica smiled softly. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We have so much more work to do." In the days that followed, Monica saw just how much impact the case had made. Conversations between community leaders, law enforcement, and local activists began happening. People were finally asking the hard questions. The case had sparked a ripple effect, not just in Charleston, but across the state. Monica used her platform to push for new policies, transparency in policing, de-escalation training, and better oversight. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what she had. The fight for justice was far from over. But moments like this reminded her that change, though slow, was possible. One afternoon, Monica stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching as a group of young activists gathered for a peaceful rally. They held signs calling for fairness, accountability, and reform. She watched them, a quiet sense of hope blooming in her chest. The system wasn't perfect, but with enough voices, enough action, it could be pushed toward progress. And that, she thought, was the kind of justice worth fighting for. If this story resonated with you, don't stay silent. Justice begins with awareness. It begins with conversation. It begins with people like you. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that inspire action and reflection. Let's work together to make the world a fairer place. Because change starts with us.